Patrick Wayne Kearney, also known as a trash bag killer, is an American serial killer and necrophiliac, active between 1962 and 1977, who killed a minimum of 21 men and young boys in Southern California. However, his true number of victims is likely considerably higher, making him potentially one of the most prolific serial killers in US history. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Patrick Wayne Kearney was born on September the 24th, 1939, in Los Angeles, California, the eldest of three children who grew up in a middle-class household. A thin and sickly child, Kearney was bullied at school, being taunted due to being, quote, queer. This led him to withdraw into himself and have fantasies of killing his tormentors, including skinning them alive. Kearney's father taught him how to kill pigs by shooting them behind the ear, and he began to find this act arousing, leading to him killing animals unsupervised, opening them up and rolling around in their blood and guts. Kearney's behaviour led him to engage in acts of bestiality with the animals on the property, including the family dog, who he engaged in sexual acts with from the age of around 13 years old. Kearney also began to develop dark fantasies about dominating his sexual partners. Kearney was able to keep his dark fantasies a secret, as well as his sexuality, and he spent time cruising the gay bars in California, including San Diego, as well as going further afield, using his proficiency in Spanish to pick up men in Tijuana, Mexico. It's believed that he honed his skills targeting gay men during this time, something he would rely on during his murderous rampage just a few years later. In 1958, at the age of 19, Kearney joined the Air Force and, after basic training, was stationed in Texas, where a year later he met and began a relationship with David Hill. In 1961, at age 21, Kearney was honourably discharged and moved to California with Hill. However, the relationship didn't last long before Hill returned to his wife in 1962. At this point, the floodgates appeared to open, and Kearney began his killing spree. Kearney killed his first three victims in 1962, none of whom have ever been identified. The first victim was a 19-year-old white male who he convinced to ride his motorcycle. When they got to a secluded area outside Indio, California, Kearney shot the male in the head and sexually assaulted his corpse. Soon afterwards, Kearney killed a 16-year-old white male who he stated was the cousin of the first victim. Kearney shot this child in the head and had sex with his corpse. The third victim, known only as George, was lured into Kearney's vehicle in San Diego and was taken to his house, where he was shot in the head immediately upon entering. Kearney then engaged in sex acts with the corpse before skinning and dismembering him and then burying him behind the garage. Despite these remains being recovered, the true identity of George has never been discovered. The murders then stopped, and articles I've read suggest that Kearney was scared of being caught by law enforcement, but I think a more important point is that at the end of 1962, beginning of 1963, David Hill returned into Kearney's life, and the two began living together. However, the relationship was not stable, and was characterised by frequent arguments. Hill left Kearney again in June 1971, and within a matter of weeks, Kearney killed again. The victim was 13-year-old John Denchick, who went missing whilst hiking on the 26th of June 1971. His remains were not found for 8 months. The only information I can find was that Kearney shot him in the head. It's unclear whether he interfered with his body. Even at this early stage, Kearney was refining his modus operandi. As a short man, between 5'5" and 5'7", he knew he would be unable to overpower most males that he targeted, so his method was to incapacitate them almost immediately, sometimes whilst driving, with a bullet to the head, and then take the corpse to a remote location where he would have sex with them, skin them and dissect them, before placing their remains in trash bags and dumping them. He would leave their bodies in various locations, including in canyons, landfills, and the desert, where they'd be eaten by wild animals. Kearney would sometimes drain the blood from his victims to eliminate any odour and bathe them to minimise trace evidence being recovered. Various reports put Kearney's IQ at 180, which would be genius level, but this is unconfirmed and, in my opinion, is likely an exaggerated figure. However, what is clear is that Kearney had a higher than average intellect and is the epitome of an organised serial killer who honed his craft in order to satisfy his deviant sexual perversions whilst avoiding detection. Kearney has been confirmed to have killed 21 young men and children. His targeting of children shows that, as well as engaging in necrophilia and bestiality, he was also a paedophile. Kearney's youngest victim was Ronald Dean Smith Jr., who was aged just 5 years old. On August the 24th, 1974, Ronald was abducted by Kearney in a park in Lenox, California. Reports indicate that Kearney held the child for 2 days, had sex with his corpse before disposing of his body, where it was found over a month later. By 1974, Kearney was killing approximately once a month. It would take a long time to go through all of his victims, but these are a few examples of this man's level of evil. Victim 11 was 13-year-old Oliver Peter Melito, who, on March 21st, 1976, was picked up by Kearney whilst hitchhiking, before being shot, sexually assaulted post-mortem, and then dismembered, with his body parts being dumped in various locations in the Palos Verdes landfill in LA. His remains were not recovered. Victim 13 was 13-year-old Michael Craig McGee, who, on June the 11th, 1976, was hitchhiking from Inglewood Avenue to Torrance, a distance of less than 10 miles. Kearney admitted later in police interview that he had befriended Michael and convinced him to go on a camping trip with him. However, he stated he then perceived Michael as a threat due to him talking about potentially burglarising Kearney's property, and he then impulsively shot him. Kearney implied to the police that he had destroyed Michael's remains, with him bragging, quote, "I disposed of the body. You aren't going to find him." Victim 19 was 17-year-old Robert Benefell, who Kearney picked up whilst he was hitchhiking in the autumn of 1976. Following his normal routine, Robert was shot, sexually violated post-mortem, skinned and dismembered, with his body parts being placed in trash bags and dumped in various locations. However, by 1977, Kearney's inability to control his murderous and sexual impulses meant that he started to make mistakes. In 1977, Kearney killed 3 people. In January, he murdered 28-year-old Nicolas Hernandez Jimenez. In February, he murdered 24-year-old Arturo Ramos Marquez, who, like so many others, was shot in the head, had his body violated, and was then dismembered, with his remains being dumped like rubbish. It was the murder of his penultimate victim, John Otis LeMay, in March 1977, which led to Kearney's downfall. At approximately 5:30 p.m. on Sunday, March 13th, 1977, John LeMay had told his neighbour that he was going to Redondo Beach to meet a man named Dave, who he had met at a local gym. This was David Hill, who had given John his home address, which was the one he shared with Kearney. John went to the address and found that Hill was not there, but Kearney invited him to watch television. Whilst John was watching television, Kearney suddenly shot him in the head, and like the others, had sex with his corpse, dismembered him, and dumped his body in the desert. However, this murder was sloppy and unplanned, and John was reported missing, which led police to speak to neighbours, and it became apparent that he had been in the company of Hill and Kearney. Unfortunately, before he could be arrested, Kearney claimed his final victim, 8-year-old Merle Chance, who was abducted by Kearney on April the 6th, 1977, whilst he was riding his bike near to where Kearney worked. Kearney smothered Merle, sexually abused his corpse after death, before dumping his body. When police eventually came looking for Kearney, he and Hill had fled, leading to a nationwide manhunt. Kearney and Hill fled to El Paso, Texas, and were eventually convinced by their families to give themselves up. On the 1st of July 1977, Kearney and Hill handed themselves in to Riverside County Sheriff's Department, and he was initially indicted for 3 murders, including John LeMay. However, it became clear very quickly that Kearney was responsible for far more murders. This news report from the time shows coverage of this case.
Are investigating a bizarre murder case in which as many as 16 young men have been killed. Bill Windsor reports.
Investigators in Riverside County are still going over the records of 8 murder cases, which may be the start of a bloody trail of 40 or more homosexual killings. 2 men, Patrick Kearney and David Hill, wanted for questioning in 2 murders, surrendered here last Friday. Officers also wanted to talk to them about 5 other similar killings. Mutilated remains of 5 young men have been found in 3 other counties since 1975. But Sheriff Ben Clark says the 2 led his investigators to believe the suspects may be responsible for 30 to 40 killings. The sheriff isn't sure the final toll will be that high.
Well, my guess is at least we'll double the number that we have identified in the series that we were working on originally. And of course, beyond that, really, I'd hesitate to make any guess.
That would be about 16, then.
That's true.
Sheriff, you talk about similarities in these cases. What similarities do you mean?
In the original release that we had made, we'd identified a number of things that were similarities. Number one is that they were all young, that some of them had connections with in the area of homosexual activity. There had been a single gunshot wound to the head. They were nude. They had been tied up and they had been disposed of in plastic bags. Now,
there may or may not be 30 or 40 more bodies out here. If there are, no one knows now just where to start looking. Officers say only they could be about anywhere in Southern California. Bill Windsor, NBC News, Riverside, California.
Patrick Kearney confessed to 35 murders. However, it's suspected that his victim count may be anywhere up to the mid-40s. This would place his number of kills above Ted Bundy, which is believed to be the 30s, and the 33 victims of John Wayne Gacy, but his total is dwarfed by the number of victims of Samuel Little, the most prolific serial killer in US history, who killed between 60 and 90 people. Authorities were only able to obtain physical evidence to prove Kearney's involvement in 21 murders, although they know he committed many more. In a deal to take the death penalty off the table, Kearney pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 21 life sentences with no chance of parole. David Hill was not convicted of any offences and appears to have convinced authorities he knew nothing of Kearney's crimes. I'm not sure I buy that. He didn't notice any change in his partner's behaviour or the fact that he kept disappearing all the time. And why did he run to Texas if he had nothing to hide? Despite his high number of kills and the despicable nature of his crimes, including killing and dismembering children, this is not a well-known case and seems to have been overshadowed by other notorious serial killers who used parts of California as their hunting ground, including Edmund Kemper, who killed 10 women between 1964 and 1973 in Santa Cruz County, and Randy Kraft, who killed as many as 60 young men between 1971 and 1983, predominantly in California, but also in Oregon and Michigan. I may do a video on Kraft, as it's a very interesting case. Due to this, there are no pictures of Kearney after his arrest in the 1970s that I can find, no interviews with him, or details about his life in prison. I haven't even been able to find an up-to-date photograph of the now 83-year-old Patrick Kearney. But what is known is that he's currently incarcerated at Mule Creek State Prison, located in California, where he will inevitably spend the rest of his days. This is the second case I've covered which involves men who engage in sexual acts with dead bodies, the first being the crimes of David Fuller, the morgue monster. Check out that video if you have a moment, and I gave a little bit of my opinion about his profile. Again, I preface this section by stating that the psychology of people like David Fuller and Patrick Kearney is likely complex and would take years to unpick, but I think I can give some basic insight. So whilst Fuller did not kill people whose bodies he violated, there are, in my opinion, parallels between these two men. Both seem to be quite weak and timid, who seem to have lacked control in their own lives. With Kearney, he was physically slight and was withdrawn due to bullying in his childhood. He entered into a relationship that seemed very unhealthy with David Hill leaving Kearney on at least 2 occasions and the pair frequently arguing. I don't think it's coincidence that Kearney's killings started when his relationship with Hill initially broke down, and that his later crimes seem to coincide with when the pair argued. I believe that Kearney was emotionally dependent on his relationship with Hill, scared of moving on and finding something more healthy, and so, to deal with his feelings of powerlessness and inadequacy, he killed men and children, demonstrating the ultimate power over these people by taking away their lives and then having total control over their corpses, using them to live out his fantasies and then disposing of them. It should be noted that Kearney also apparently assaulted some of his victims after they were dead, taking out his rage on their bodies. I imagine that Kearney found the act of killing and abusing the bodies gave him emotional and sexual release, as well as making him feel like a god, which stood in stark contrast to the pathetic man he really was. It's likely that killing animals as a child showed Kearney the power that someone can wield over a living thing, deciding whether they live or die. I believe that in order to internally justify killing men and children, Kearney likely saw his victims in the same way, merely as cattle to be disposed of. So, what are your thoughts on this case? Had you heard about the crimes of Patrick Kearney before? I want to thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.